I'm Niall Paterson. Welcome to the Sky News Daily, where I am feeling very refreshed after a few days off. And it's a pretty good thing because it is a very busy day out there on the campaign trail. We've had policy announcements from both the Conservatives and Labour, culture wars versus actual wars. We've had Nigel Farage making an emergency statement. Hold tight for the latest on that. But we're going to begin with the polls. No, not of the greasy nor the 10-foot barge variety, instead of the type that have been giving Rishi Sunak nightmares almost ever since he entered at number 10. Our chief political correspondent is Jon Craig, and he joins us once again on the Daily. Jon, look, this is a collaboration between Sky News and the pollsters YouGov. They will be with us for the duration of this campaign. They have essentially taken a snapshot of where the polls are right now and extrapolated that out to imagine what the world might look like, or at least the United Kingdom, at the day after the polls close.
It's a stunning poll. It suggests that Keir Starmer could be heading to Downing Street with a majority of, wait for it, 194 seats.
Whoa.
That is bigger than Tony Blair's 179 majority in 1997. It's predicting a Tory wipeout in large parts of the country, a Lib Dem surge, and the Scottish National Party losing more than half their seats in Scotland.
OK, Jon, allow me to caveat the living heck out of what we have just heard, in the sense that, look, I understand how YouGov have done this. They've taken where we are in the polls as of this moment and extrapolated it out. But as you and I both know, an awful lot can happen in an election campaign. This is but a snapshot of a moment in time. I mean, I'm just going to say, if this is what it looks like on the day after we go to the polls, I will be very, very surprised indeed.
Me too. I mean, yes, opinion polls are a snapshot. And another accepted norm of general elections is that governing parties tend to close the gap on their opposition party opponents, as the campaign goes on. What we've seen in this campaign at the beginning, here we are at the beginning of week 2 of the official campaign, the polls have not shifted at all, really. The Tories are not closing the gap, despite policies like national service, more help for pensioners, and so on. Let me mention some of the big beasts who could be vulnerable, Neil. Jeremy Hunt down in Surrey, Grant Shapps, Welwyn and Hatfield, Penny Mordaunt in Portsmouth North, Victoria Prentice, the Attorney General, potentially, Alex Chalk, the Justice Secretary, he's MP for Cheltenham, David Davis, the Welsh Secretary possibly, and Johnny Mercer, the Veterans Minister, he's down in Plymouth. It looks bad. What I would say is that I've always been very sceptical of all these polls that have suggested a massive Labour victory, because if you compare it with 97, in 97, John Major having won a majority of 21 in 1992, that majority just shrank and shrank with by-election losses and so on. He had no majority left by 97. The Tories now, Boris Johnson won a majority of 80. Our colleague Michael Thrasher, our Sky's election guru, he reckons that with boundary changes, the Tories are defending a notional majority of 94. That's why Sir Keir Starmer, rightly in my view, talks about Labour having a mountain to climb.
Jon, look, looking at this data, and it is disastrous for the Conservative Party. We would both concede that. I just wonder what that might mean. Do we sense that there will be a change in their campaigning? And indeed, Labour, is there anything that they need to do to change?
This poll will spread panic amongst Tory MPs and candidates, many of whom fear they're going to lose their seats. I mean, these figures are worse than the Tories' worst nightmares, really. And there'll be doom and gloom. The Tory right will go on the attack again. We've already seen Liz Truss and her supporters demanding immediate tax cuts. The Tory right will go berserk. They will really attack Rishi Sunak. And as for the Labour Party, well, they will be worried about this because Sir Keir and senior Labour politicians keep warning against complacency. The fact is that a suggestion that Labour are going to win by a landslide, Labour will fear that makes people think, oh, well, perhaps I can stay at home, or perhaps flirt with one of the smaller parties like the Lib Dems or the Green or someone else. It also plays into the Reform UK argument, that of Nigel Farage and Richard Tice, that the result is a foregone conclusion. and therefore people can afford to vote for reform.
And John, I mean, he never fails to bring attention on himself. The man, of course, I'm referring to, Nigel Farage, who we thought, we were reliably informed, was taking very much a backseat role for reform during this election. He announced to great consternation, or indeed excitement, depending, I suppose, on your view of the man, that he had an emergency announcement to make at 4 o'clock. He has delivered that announcement. What on earth's going on?
He is indeed going to be a candidate, despite saying a week or so ago he wasn't, and he's going to stand in Clacton. Now, that is the seat up in the north of Essex where UKIP, Mr Farage's former party, won a by-election when Douglas Carswell defected from the Conservatives to UKIP and then won a by-election. It's gone back to the Tories now. It's held by Giles Watling, a former TV actor. Well, Nigel Farage entering the race as party leader and candidate. Well, if this campaign hasn't been brought to life already, certainly has now. The magician has pulled off another trick. He's got us all excited and he hasn't disappointed. He's running.
And who knows, perhaps eighth time will be the charm for Nigel Farage. But let's focus our attention, John, back on what's been happening with the two main parties. And a little bit of a contrast between, well, on the one hand, the Conservatives talking about and fighting the so-called culture wars, and also on the Labour side, a big day when it comes to how we would prosecute an actual war, if ever, God forbid, we were involved with one. Let's start with the Conservatives. What have we been hearing today? Changes to the Equality Act.
On the so-called gender wars, what the government has announced is that they plan to amend the Equality Act. Now, this was a piece of legislation passed. You'd think it all sounds terribly Blairite, but it was actually Gordon Brown's government that passed it towards the end of the 2005 to 2010 Parliament. And it gave protection for all sorts of groups, including transgender people. But the Tories now say it's out of date. And that's why they're planning to, as they say, update the law and bring it up to date. Now, the Prime Minister, when he was asked about it, you're just, this is culture wars with Labour. No, he said. And yet, the Tory party earlier in the day tweeted, "We know what a woman is, Keir Starmer doesn't." So that's obviously the thinking behind this Tory proposal on equality and gender laws and so on.
It does rather beg the question, if this was such a big issue for the Tories, why didn't they sort it out before now?
Well, that's a question that Kemi Badenoch, the Equalities Minister, was asked here on Sky News and also in other interviews she did during the day. Kemi Badenoch, in announcing this move, has talked about whether it's rapists being housed in women's prisons or instances of men playing in women's sports where they have an unfair advantage. It's clear public authorities and regulatory bodies are confused about what the law says on sex and gender and when to act, often for fear for being accused of transphobia or not being inclusive. So that's the argument that she is making. Labour, of course, argues, well, actually, you don't need a new Equality Act. And the suspicion, really, and it's a fair point, I think, the Tories just want to create a dividing line here with the Labour Party. That's why Kemi Badenoch is talking about it. The Prime Minister, when he was asked about it, tried to sound all terribly reasonable. But as I said, the game was given away with that Tory tweet which says we know what a woman is, Keir Starmer doesn't.
Let's turn our attention to Labour, and some pretty punchy language, I have to say, from Sir Keir Starmer, talking about a new age of insecurity, talking about Labour's defence policy when in government. Was there anything new in it, John? Because we heard him commit to the nuclear deterrent, we heard him commit to spending 2.5% of GDP on defence, and I thought I knew that already.
This was all about trying to persuade voters that Labour has changed, and it certainly has changed. Can you imagine Jeremy Corbyn saying the sort of words that Sir Keir has been saying alongside John Healey, who incidentally was Shadow Defence Secretary under Mr Corbyn? It's all about a message. You can trust us on defence. We've changed since Mr Corbyn, who of course was unilateralist, a big CND supporter, Stop the War, all those groups. We've seen from Sir Keir, he wants to put himself forward as a Prime Minister in waiting who can be trusted on defence, on issues like Ukraine, on standing up to the Soviet Union. and also on the dreadful things happening in the Middle East at the moment. I mean, up to now, he's more or less stood shoulder to shoulder with the Conservatives. It was interesting that the backdrop was some parliamentary candidates who had served in the armed forces. And Labour were actually talking about how they were the party of the armed forces. The Tories, of course, have said, some of your shadow cabinets voted against Trident. They did. I mean, that was Angela Rayner and David Lammy, but that was when Corbyn was leader. And Keir has insisted that the whole shadow cabinet is united by what he's saying.
Jon, thanks very much indeed. Stay where you are. After the break, we will continue to talk about those policy announcements from the Conservatives and indeed Labour and ask the very big question, does anyone care? Back in a sec. Welcome back. Some admittedly pretty significant announcements from both the Conservatives and Labour and indeed Nigel Farage today. But when it comes to an elections, look, journalists like me can often say that something is eye-catching, that something is bold in Sir Humphrey terms. But the biggest question of all is, what do the public think about it? Scarlett Maguire is from pollsters JL Partners, and I suppose she'll have a better idea than I. Scarlett, welcome to the podcast. Can we start with the Conservatives first? Because over the course of their time in government, we have had an increasing amount in that area that some would describe as culture wars. But this sort of change to legislation, I mean, how popular do you think it might actually be?
I think it will be very popular with some voters, which I think will be the voters they're targeting. We can see that from their campaign strategy so far, this string of very eye-catching policy announcements, what they're trying to do is to shore up their base now. There's good reason for that. At the moment, they're only holding on to half of the people who voted for them in 2019.
Wow.
So I think what's happening is they're giving up on winning over any new voters because they know that's very unlikely. They're already doing quite badly. So they're looking to go to those voters which are conservative currently, which have switched to reform or have gone conservative to don't know. And we know that these voters are disproportionately older. We also know actually that a lot of these voters are women, especially the voters currently saying don't know. So I suspect that's partly in their mind with all these strategies, with the gender announcements we had today, with the national service and with the quadruple pension lock.
If we just imagine for a second that this policy was handed down from the mountaintops rather than announced by Rishi Sunak and Kemi Badenoch, is this the type of thing that interests people in general? I mean, if we're talking about younger people, middle-aged people, rather than the kind of 60-pluses that appear to be the Tory core support, I mean, how does this sort of stuff play with them, or is it dismissed as part of the culture war frippery?
I think it's dismissed too easily as part of culture wars. I think it does matter hugely to some people. But what I would say is that where this, and I think the other announcements that we've had so far in the campaign fall, is that even though they might be popular with some voters, very unpopular with others, but even though they might be very popular with some voters, they're still not as important to them as fundamental delivery on their priorities, which we know are the economy, the NHS and immigration. So anything which is sort of removed from that, I don't think is going to be hugely successful in winning people over. Now, I think they were hoping it might spark an internal row with Labour that might spill out or put Labour in a tricky position. Labour has found itself in a tricky position with these debates before. So, that is definitely part of the strategy here, to expose Labour's weaknesses and try and distract from some of their own, which have been on display. But I think their problem is going to be that they are standing on a record of 14 years. And we know that the voters we have spoken to have judged them badly on those 14 years and have stopped listening to them. And I think that's their biggest problem. So we've got all these eye-catching announcements, but I don't think the public's paying a huge amount of attention to this campaign yet. And if they are, it's certainly not showing in the polls.
What then of Labour? Now, look, any party in opposition who wants to enter Downing Street needs to have foreign policy. What are they trying to do right now? Because as we've already discussed on the podcast, Grant Shapps, the Defence Secretary, points out, Keir Starmer twice tried to make Jeremy Corbyn Prime Minister. And on that, the Tories would suggest, Keir Starmer can therefore not be trusted on defence.
Yeah, it's very interesting what Labour are doing, and I think it falls again into their strategy generally, which is basically to signal that they are anything but the Labour Party that went to the polls in 2019. So we see this over and over again. I think that's behind a lot of the now quite public internal battles with the left of its wing within the parliamentary party and within its various bodies. But they are doing everything they can on every issue to show we are not Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party. Now, we've seen that's caused them some problems, especially when it comes to the conflict in the Middle East, but they are targeting or at least they're trying to not scare off Conservative 2019 voters. So both parties are fighting over this pool of voters, and that is determining their strategies. I suspect Labour will not be able to govern like that because they'll have a much broader coalition that they have to start paying attention to that will have voted them in. But at the moment, they are trying to signal they're not going to do anything scary with the economy, and they can be trusted on issues like security, defence and immigration, and that's part of their strategy today.
Is there any evidence that it is working? Or indeed, is there any evidence that Sir Keir Starmer is negatively affected by that close relationship that he once enjoyed with Jeremy Corbyn?
So on the first point, is there any evidence that it's working? Yes, in that voters are prepared to vote for Keir Starmer against the Conservative Party. Do think with most voters that's still what it is. It's a vote to get the government out rather than necessarily an effusive backing of Keir Starmer and his platform. But they've succeeded in detoxifying themselves and not making them a scary alternative. So I think that has succeeded. We've even seen something like defence. Quite a lot of polls now have the Labour Party more trusted on defence than the Conservatives, which is extraordinary. And actually, even 6 months ago, that was one of the few issues that the Conservatives could still bank on having a small lead on. So yes, I think that is working. On your second point, I think what was quite interesting, if you cast your mind back to last summer, so nearly a year ago, when Keir Starmer expelled Jeremy Corbyn from the Parliamentary Labour Party, that was a very decisive moment. And actually, something that I think has gone very under-commented on is when Rishi Sunak failed to take a stance against Boris Johnson after the Partygate committees and the parliamentary vote. We heard in several focus groups in the weeks after that, and actually you could watch Rishi Sunak's personal ratings start to tumble after that, direct comparisons between Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer. And people would say things like, at least Keir Starmer was brave enough to kick out Jeremy Corbyn. Why didn't Rishi Sunak do the same thing? So I think that's signalling. They went so hard on it. There was lots of press on it. It was a very public fight. That seemed to work with the electorate.
I'd have to wonder then, Scarlett, what you make, and indeed what both Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer will make of the news that has taken many of us by surprise, that Nigel Farage is, I think for the 8th time, going to be standing to be an elected representative. I mean, who is this guy actually going to help? Presumably, it certainly helps reform, or does taking him off the campaign trail actually do a disservice to the rest of the candidates that he could have been supporting up and down the country?
I think undeniably this is going to help reform. So we polled this. Now, it is difficult to poll hypotheticals. It's not perfect, but we did poll this just under a month ago. And we found that if Nigel Farage returned, he would add 6 points to reform UK's vote share. So that is really significant. And again, that's partly because reform is still struggling with name recognition. And so is Richard Tice, their leader. This is something they've been struggling with for a while. They saw it increase a bit when Nigel Farage went into the jungle. And this would help them all over again. Nigel Farage is a very polarising figure, but voters that like him a lot. And actually, something you're increasingly hearing in focus groups is when people say, oh, well, I might not agree with Nigel Farage, but at least unlike normal politicians, he says what he thinks. And people quite often compare him in that way, in a favourable light, to Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak, who they both think is sort of your more run-of-the-mill politician that might be just saying what they're saying to get elected rather than saying what they're saying because they believe in it. And therefore, I think it could potentially be an extinction-level event for the Conservatives. It really is the absolute last thing that Rishi Sunak needs right now.
Scarlett Maguire, great to have you on the Sky News Daily. Thanks for your time. Well, as the screeching, jarring U-turn by Reform's former honorary president, now leader Nigel Farage, demonstrates, things can change pretty quickly in politics. But, as Mr Farage knows only too well, polls are a good indicator of electoral success or failure. And it can be awfully difficult to turn the ship around when the direction it's heading in is straight down. That's your lot for this edition of The Daily. We'll see you again tomorrow.